Week is Congressman Paul of Texas, who has just been named the chair of the subcommittee on domestic monetary policy with the incoming Congress. He's joining us from the Capitol, and our questioners for Newsmakers are Sudeep Reddy of the Wall Street Journal and Robin Harding of the Financial Times. Gentlemen, thanks to both of you. We're obviously going to talk with the congressman about his interest as the subcommittee chair, but before we get to that, Congressman Paul, I wanted to ask you a political question, which is, if in fact this tax package passes, what, if any, political implications will there be for the people who elected the Republican House majority?
You know, it's so confusing, and there's some pluses and minuses on both sides of this argument, and it really has split a lot of the conservatives. I happen to be in favor of the tax package. I don't want taxes to go up, but there's talk right now at the present time of even changing it more, and so we don't know what exactly will be in the final vote. But I don't think this can be the litmus test to decide whether or not the new Congress, especially in the House, will be considered, at fault. I think that remains to be seen.
Well, Sudeep Reddy, let's turn to the new Congress and your questions.
Dr. Paul, I first wanted to start off with a kind of an overview of what do you hope to accomplish as chairman of this subcommittee, and what does it mean to you to have somebody who actually wants to end the central bank actually overseeing it?
Well, I will continue to do exactly what I've been doing. I just have a better audience with a little more authority to do it. I've been talking about the danger of central economic planning through the Federal Reserve for as long as I can remember, especially since the early 70s. But this gives me a better platform, and the fact that I wrote a book that said "End the Fed," actually, the book is pretty modest in its proposal in that I explain all the fallacies of the monetary system that we have. I don't attack individuals as much as the system, especially since 1971. And my ultimate proposal there, as it has been over the years, even back in the 80s with the Gold Commission, was just allow us to have competition. If the dollar is a good currency to operate with, let's just allow gold and silver to circulate. But today, if you use gold and silver as legal tender in payment of debt, as the Constitution says, you could go to jail for this. So we are compelled by law to use depreciating money, and therefore who wants to save money for 20 years if the money might be worth 1/3 of what it is when you put it away? So it's a system that is doomed to fail. We're in the process of seeing that come about. We've had the financial crisis. We're in the middle of that, and that was predictable. And also those individuals who predicted the problems that we have today are predicting that this is going to get a lot worse.
So, Congressman Paul, what specific things would you like to achieve in the next Congress? What's success for you over the next 2 years?
I think the most important thing is more transparency. We essentially have none. We got a token effort for the Fed to report a little more detail on what the lending agencies did during the bailout period, and they've released $3.3 trillion that they've injected into the economy, but it's incomplete. It doesn't tell us what the collateral was and who exactly. They did release some names, but there are a lot of unanswered questions. I think I should be top of the list on finding out exactly what they did, but then to continue with the audit effort. I had 320 co-sponsors last year, or this current year, and we have new people coming in who are more anti-Fed than the current group of people. So I think we're going to keep that alive, and the American people understand transparency is very important, and I get strong support from the grassroots of America for this.
Congressman, in this recent release that you're talking about that came this month, we've actually found out of that $3 trillion, we found out that there were big banks that received the money, investment banks, foreign central banks. Do you have a problem with that? We obviously know about it, but what's the issue there that you don't like about having this money be used in this way?
Well, yeah, I have a big problem with it because, it was thought at one time in our history that all appropriations would go through the Congress. We would authorize and appropriate, and the Congress would control it. But this is all off the books. This is secret. The Fed prints their own money, creates the credit, and they spend it. Their budget's bigger than ours now. And and the people who get bailed out are the ones who are in the political know. They say that what I want might politicize the Fed. How could it be more political if certain interests are, some companies were bailed out and some were left to go bankrupt. Lehman went bankrupt. The Goldman Sachs were treated pretty well. So we need this information. Those individuals who benefited the most from the bubble formation in the housing and other bubbles that were formed, they're the ones who got overextended. They were ready to go bankrupt, so they screamed and hollered and said, the end of the world's coming unless you bail out the banks. So we ended up buying that stuff. The Fed owns these illiquid assets. The American people, the workers, are suffering. They lost their jobs and they can't pay their mortgages and they're losing their homes. So it's a very, very unfair system. It's bad economics and it's really not legal under the Constitution.
I want to go back to your suggestion that you now have a more or less a bigger megaphone with the subcommittee chairmanship. And maybe you can tell us what your understanding of is how far the Republican leadership is willing to go with your investigation of the Fed. When you've talked with Chairman Baucus, incoming Chairman Baucus, for example, what are you in concert with the direction that you're taking the subcommittee, and will you receive support from him as it moves to full committee level?
I'm working on the assumption that I will. I mean, the conversations I've had with the chairman, basically said, you're in charge of that subcommittee. Now, that doesn't mean that, the first week in January, I send over a subpoena for Bernanke and demand that he come over with a pile of papers. I don't think that would be logical. But to start sending requests to even their accountants and other people and say, this is what I want, and to see what happens, because there's a lot of information that under current law now, because the law has been changed, and we want at least that. And then they can still hide behind the law if I want to demand every transaction with foreign banks. So in a way, it's enlightening to know that they bailed out a foreign central bank, but they deal with foreign central banks and foreign governments even before the bailout was occurring. But that is one set of information that they cling to, and so I will continue to work on that. But it's to the American people's benefit for us to know who's getting bailed out.
Congressman, doesn't the US benefit from the dollar being used as a global currency? And if the Fed doesn't lend to foreign central banks when they need money, how can the dollar remain a global currency?
Well, the market will determine that. Ultimately, the market is much more powerful than the Fed. I complain about the Fed and all, but just think of how we tried to prop up the dollar in the 60s and early 70s. We said, yes, the dollar's as good as gold. It's $35 an ounce, until the market overwhelmed and said the Bretton Woods is dead. It was the market that did that. They didn't come to their senses and do that. So yes, we get tremendous benefits, and nobody wants to really talk about it because they know it. Until now, they're starting to recognize that people around the world are getting a little bit skittish about the dollar. And now the response to our easing isn't giving us the same results. With this newly announced easing, interest rates have gone up. They haven't gone down. So there's a limit to what the Fed can do. They're supposed to be in charge of unemployment, and they wonder whether they should have that mandate or not. What difference does it make? They give us an unemployment rate, according to the Treasury, it's over 17%. According to the free market economists, it's over 22%. So their policies are failing, and that's becoming more evident every day.
Congressman, when you and I have talked in the past, you've acknowledged that the Fed has been able to moderate the business cycle, and that we would have some sharper ups and sharper downs in the economy if not for a central bank. I wanted to get at that idea a little bit more. What would a world, an economy run by Ron Paul look like, and how would that actually play out to real people in terms of being able to access credit and being able to function in an economy like we have now?
Well, if you didn't have fiat money, you would have reasonably stable prices, although that is not the goal of having stable prices. You want free market pricing. But if you had a stable dollar, that's what you want, a stable currency, one that cannot be manipulated, and you want interest rates to be determined by the marketplace. And under these conditions, it's virtually impossible to have boom-bust cycles. You would have some prices going up. Weather still might have, an influence on farm commodity prices and those kind of things. But you don't have a whole economy. Just think we had a housing bubble, but that just didn't affect housing. That affected everything, banking and so many other things, and stocks as well. So you wouldn't have that if you didn't have this artificial manipulation of credit. And to me, the greatest sin, economic sin, that is committed by doing this is ruining the market signal about what the consumer and the businessman must do, and that's the interest rates. If you got rid of prices in our economy, like wage and price controls, like we did in 1971, it's become socialistic, and that's why socialism always failed. But we regulate by prices 1/2 of our economy because we control the money supply and the interest rates, and that is the source of our problem.
Now I want to follow up on that point. You mentioned bubbles. Before the Fed was created in 1913, we had bubbles for centuries in not only the U.S. economy, but other economies around the world. Wouldn't you still have bubbles, and wouldn't they be just as troublesome as they are now?
They would be very narrow, but the only time we had bubbles in the 19th century is when we abused the standard. It was never immune from local banks inflating, and they certainly did that on occasion. Certainly during our Civil War period, there was tremendous inflation. They went off the gold standard, but they were forced to retrench because they still believed in the Constitution, and they had the Resumption Act of 1776, and we went back to a gold standard, quit printing money, and then we ushered in a great growth period, one of the greatest in our history, in the latter part of the 19th century until World War I started. So no, the Federal Reserve provides no real benefits to us long term.
Let me follow up on that further. Before the Fed, there were more recessions, and they were more severe recessions. There were more financial panics, and they were more severe financial panics. Is that a price you're willing to pay, going back to that, to rein in the Fed now?
Well, I don't want to pay that price. Even if you argue the case that we had those before, we still could prevent them because they were artificial. But if they do happen, yes, you do. You pay the price of 1 year of a bad recession like we did in 1921 and 1920. And that was the last example of us having a hands-off approach. And the debt was liquidated. The GDP went down rapidly, and people went back to work. But you got rid of the bad debt and the bad investment. Today, our whole goal is to perpetuate the mistakes. So what have we been doing up here? We're trying to encourage building of houses. We're trying to keep housing prices up, and we buy the bad debt. We don't allow the people's, we don't allow the liquidation of the debt. So yes, after somebody else messes up the economy, the free market is demanding that we liquidate and go back to a period of time where you can have economic growth again. But I think you're touching on the important points. Politically, though, it looks like it's painful. If they did exactly what I wanted in 07, 07 and 08 might have been really, really bad, but we would probably be having 3% unemployment right now, and we would be back in a growth period. Japan made the same mistakes. We did in the 1930s, so we didn't do it like the 1920s, 1921, 22. But politically, we are so conditioned that if there is a problem, we have to take care of it. It's exactly like a drug addiction. The doctor who wants to get you off drugs, he's a bad guy if he won't give you your drugs. If you get the drug, you feel better. But eventually the addict dies, and that's what my concern is. I want them to take their medicine. I don't want the patient to die. I don't want our economy to die. I don't want the dollar to die, and that's what they're working on, because one of the strongest reasons for inflating, it comes from the Congress. As bad as the Fed is, the Fed accommodates the Congress. They literally, provide the funds. So if the Fed couldn't monetize our debt, interest rates would go up, and the Congress would say, "Hey, we can't get away with this," and all that does is create greater distortions and a larger bubble.
So, Congressman, are you confident that if you did rein in the Federal Reserve, then your colleagues in Congress would actually replace it with something better? Isn't there a danger that Congress itself could meddle in monetary policy, and that could be even more damaging?
Yes, I think that is a concern, but that's not my argument. I don't want Congress to manage monetary policy. I want the market to do it. I want market interest rates, and I want the market to determine the money supply. But you do raise an important question, because something much worse could come out of this, and that is an international one world fiat currency. You know, people talk about the IMF coming up with the STRs or whatnot, another currency. And that to me would be a lot worse than the dollar reserve standard, because it would be mandatory around the world. And also, though, it will provide an incentive for some nations, maybe in the Far East, to come up with a currency backed by gold, and people will want to go in that direction and reject the dollar. And we do know that gold has left west and has moved to east. So the central banks of the Far East have much, more accumulation of gold. The gold supplies in our central banks in the West have diminished. So something like that could happen. But you're right, it could be dangerous. But the danger of the Congress taking over, I recognize that. I don't want that. I don't want, because some of my allies that don't like the Fed, we call them the greenbackers. They say Congress should print the money, then we don't have to pay interest to the Federal Reserve. That is not the solution, because there's no authority. Matter of fact, there's an explicit prohibition against printing money, whether it's the Fed or the Congress.
We have about 10 minutes left in our conversation.
Congressman, you've made auditing the Fed kind of a central plank of your movement, and I wanted to talk about that for a minute. A lot of people hear the word audit and they don't quite know what it means. In this case, the Federal Reserve's books are actually audited by an outside accounting firm, a private accounting firm, and what you're talking about is more of a policy audit, to have congressional auditors go in and be able to look at the Fed's policy decisions. The Fed, of course, fears that this will lead to congressional and political meddling in its decisions about interest rates, which can cause all sorts of problems with the economy. What do you think about this idea of auditing creating a problem for the Federal Reserve? And interest rates are watched very closely by markets, and the risk of volatility there.
Well, yes, and that was my point earlier. They do look at interest rates, and the Fed is responsible for the interest rates, and that's where our real problem is. So unless we get a handle on that, I don't see how we can solve our problems at all.
Do you think that the movement to audit the Fed is actually going to lead to something that you want, which is ultimately to end the Fed? How are those two ideas connected?
Well, it is. It's to expose them. I think it could lead to allowing illegal tender competition, and allow people to get out of dollars domestically. Internationalists can do that all the time. If you're an international banker or businessman, you have to accommodate yourself and protect yourself, and be in the futures market in order to protect your currency or lack of currency. So we think you should be able to do this domestically. So exposure of the Fed is going to help us in that effort. And if the chaos, or matter of fact, when the chaos comes from a sharp attack on the dollar, there will be a growing consensus, which has already started, that we have to have monetary reform. And that will be the big question. And we should look toward the 1870s on how we did it before. But the reason why that is so difficult is the American people would have to change their attitude about what the role of government ought to be. See, I think that's the most important question. If we as a people believe that we should be the policemen of the world and have perpetual war, be in 130 countries and 740 bases, and then have a runaway welfare state where nobody gets anything cut, no, you can't really attack the monetary system. So it's that attitude which creates the problem, and the Fed is the financier. If you stop the financier, you would put you could put a halt to that. But ultimately, the American people should accept the idea that our government was created to protect our liberties. It wasn't there to regulate our lives and regulate our economy and police the world.
Cool. We have about 7 minutes left. Quick question, really. Earlier you referred to the twins' dual responsibilities of employment and also inflation. I'm wondering whether or not you anticipate that this Congress will actually rewrite the law that sets that twin mandate.
Oh, they could, and I think it's a very important subject. I think when time permits, I want to have that discussed in the committee, because it raises questions more than it gives answers. People know that, they're saying the Fed had the responsibility and they totally failed, so we take this power away, which I would probably support, but I think it's incidental to the real problem. And because the real problem of unemployment is the business cycle. Unless you address that, you can't can't deal with the unemployment. So, but I think it's a good discussion, but it doesn't provide the answer. If tomorrow we eliminated this authority to look at unemployment, I mean, what would the Fed be restrained from doing? They could still operate under these emergency powers and bailing out and injecting credit and be the lender of last resort, and they'll continue. So I don't think it would change a whole lot, but I think it's a real interesting discussion.
Robin?
Congressman, which do you think creates the greater danger of a sharp attack on the dollar and inflation? The Fed's monetary policy or the fiscal deficits that Congress keeps running?
I don't see how you can separate them, because the fiscal irresponsibility is an incentive to have the Fed, monetize the debt. But when they overstep their bounds and inject 1.2 trillion and another 600 billion, then they are really overstepping their bounds. And I think it will be, if they continue to do that, let's say the $600 billion soon be recognized that it didn't do any good and did things in an opposite manner, and interest rates goes up and unemployment rates goes up. If Bernanke sticks to his guns, he's going to have to come back and say QE3, another $1 trillion. If that's the course of events, then it will be the monetary policy which domineers, and that'll be secondary to the fiscal policy. But fiscal policy and the irresponsibility of the Congress is a big problem as well.
Congressman, the Fed is often accused of being too close to banks, and obviously being the central bank, that's partly by design. I wanted to ask you, though, about something that Spencer Backus, the incoming chairman of the Financial Services Committee, and someone you'll be working closely with, said recently in an interview with the Birmingham paper. He said, in Washington, the view is that the banks are to be regulated, and my view is that Washington and the regulators are there to serve the banks. He later clarified that to say that he was worried about micromanaging. But what do you think of a comment like that?
Well, I didn't hear the full comment. I think I overheard him talking to somebody, and he said that he was completely taken out of context. I don't think any politician would stick his neck out and say, well, I'm here to take care of the banks, especially under these circumstances, because I don't know the details of that, because he was a strong supporter, one of the early supporters for auditing the Fed. And, if he explained himself, I bet we'd come to a pretty close agreement, because I think one of our problems has been over-regulations, not under-regulations. I want the markets to regulate. I want the bankruptcies to occur, and you regulate in the marketplace a lot differently. But to allow the Fed to create the problems and then say, oh, well, the Congress can compensate by regulations. But the housing bubble came from too much credit, but it came up with all the mandates from the Congress saying you must make some of these loans. So those kind of regulations are very bad when you're telling under these circumstances that banks have to make certain loans that are risky.
So you think regulators really should be pulling back more than they have?
I don't think we need regulators. We need law and order. We need people to fulfill their contracts. We need the government to fulfill their contracts that have honest money, so that you don't have to anticipate the devaluation of your currency. We need honest interest rates. But the market is a great regulator, and we've lost understanding and confidence that the market is probably a much stricter regulator than the special interest regulators who's, we regulate. But guess who got regulated to their advantage? It's been the big companies. So no, the regulators get, the big companies get control of the regulators. So the marketplace, it doesn't happen that way. The government's role then is to say, you fulfill your promises. If you said you're going to do something, if you're going bankrupt, you declare bankruptcy and nobody's going to bail you out, there will not be any moral hazard, because when you regulate and guarantee the lender of last resort, it creates a moral hazard and causes the banks to make a lot of mistakes.
Congressman, we're just about out of time. You've had the opportunity to see many men at the helm of the Fed. I'm wondering how you think the current chairman is doing in executing his responsibilities.
The current what?
Chairman, Ben Bernanke.
Oh. I get asked that a lot, and I think people look for me to be, very, very critical. I'm very, very critical of the policy. I think it's a lousy policy, but it's a system that that I'm most critical about. And I was critical of Greenspan the same way, because they adhere to a philosophy that I consider totally incorrect. So there I'm very, very strong. But whether he was a worse manager than Greenspan, or compare, or if you fire Greenspan and put another person in that has a philosophy of that blends in with Keynesianism and inflationism and fiat money, yeah, well, that won't make a difference. You have to analyze the whole philosophy of the monetary system, and you have to reject this system that is literally counterfeit and artificial and inflationary. This is the problem, rather than Bernanke himself.
We have 30 seconds for a final question. Either of you?
Go ahead, Brad.
If
I'm okay.
If not, we'll let that go as our final with you, Mr. Paul. Thank you, Dr. Paul, very much for being with us on this busy week in Washington, D.C.
Thank you very much for having me.
Let me turn to Sudeep Reddy and Robin Harding just to learn a little bit more about the larger politics involved with this appointment. I found a quote in one article from Barney Frank, the outgoing financial services chair, who said, Ron Paul's vision of the Fed doesn't represent the view of most Republicans. So I want to ask you the question I was intending with him, which is, what's the intent of the leadership in acceding to his chairmanship of this subcommittee?
Well, Chairman Frank is right that Ron Paul's views do not sync with most other Republicans, most other lawmakers, and really most other Americans. But he's building what he considers a movement to end the Fed. And that's important for a couple of reasons. One, because the Fed hasn't really been criticized very much over its recent history. It certainly was into the early 80s, but it's kind of been seen as an untouchable force since the financial crisis. That's changed a lot. And Ron Paul has been around for a long time, and so he's using his decades of seniority, and he finally gets a chance to, I guess, become a thorn in the side of the Fed a little bit more. So that's important given both of those currents going on. Whether it actually leads to something and any real changes in the Fed are obviously what we'll be watching.
We've obviously been focusing on the House side, but in the Dodd-Frank debate, he was joined in this challenge to the Fed by Bernie Sanders, and probably an example of politics makes strange bedfellows. Now the new Senate will have a number of Tea Party senators. What do you expect will happen with the politics of the debate over the Fed with this new Senate?
Well, I expect there'll be a great deal of criticism of the Fed, anger about the Fed, but I think one thing you have to remember is that the reason independent central banks were created was partly to give politicians something to complain about the economy, rather than actually meddling with it themselves. And the barriers to making substantial changes to how the Fed actually operates are extremely high. All the governors of the Fed are appointed on long terms, they're quite independent, and the legal framework gives the Fed a great deal of latitude. So unless the whole Congress wants to actually change the law, it's hard to see how there's going to be much more than noise and criticism coming from either house of Congress.
He said his immediate goal is greater transparency. What is he likely to make gains in that area?
He actually deserves a lot of the credit that for what he's been pushing over the last 2 years. He was an early the creator of this Audit the Fed movement, and as a result, there was a version of that, not what he wanted, but a version of that ended up in the Dodd-Frank bill that at least brought out the transparency to the $3 trillion in financial crisis loans. And so that was Ron Paul and Bernie Sanders in the Senate, and it got a lot of traction. And so in transparency, he actually has some bit of a success story. I'm doubtful that he's actually going to get to the point where he wants, where we'll be able to go and see either in real time or to have congressional auditors go in and really take apart the policy decisions of the Fed. And even a lot of the critics of the Fed say that's really not important here. What you should be doing is looking at the end results of the Fed and deciding on your own at that point whether the Fed is meeting its goals and its mandate. And there's certainly a lot you can say about that with both inflation and unemployment.
It was interesting that he was not very keen on Humphrey Hawkins reform, which, if you listen to a number of Senate hearings of late, that legislation, which did give the twin authority to the Fed, or twin mandate to the Fed, has become a subject of great discussion of late. Is his sentiment, did it surprise you that he was not so keen on the end results of that?
It doesn't surprise me that much. I think what you have to understand is that Ron Paul's worldview is very, very different from the current framework. And the proposal to change the Fed's mandate to just target inflation rather than to target inflation and employment is actually quite a minor tweak within the existing framework. So it wouldn't really meet the criteria that Ron Paul is looking for. But the other thing you have to bear in mind is the Fed probably wouldn't mind this change to just target inflation, because it sees balancing inflation and unemployment on the other side as very much two sides of the same thing. So it won't necessarily be a problem for the Fed or be opposed by the Fed if Congress does want to move towards just targeting inflation.
We have just 1 minute left. I guess to use that to look at the larger Financial Services Committee with the leadership of Mr. Backus, as you referred. What are the major things that he's indicating to come out of that committee?
Well, this is really an opportunity to go back to the debate about how much regulation we should have of the economy, of the financial system. You can debate whether there is too much or too little coming into the financial crisis. Most people think there was actually too little when you look at public opinion polls. And so this will be a test of it, of whether it makes sense to pull back. And Ron Paul is very much a libertarian in his thinking and believes we should pull back a lot of that regulation, and this will be the test to see if there's traction beyond a small group of lawmakers for this.
Mr. Harding, anything to add on what your sources tell you about that committee and what it'll do?
No, I'm afraid not. I follow the Fed more than the financial.
We are just about out of time, so we'll use that as a thank you on this very busy week for Congress as they're struggling to get to closure, and the Democratic-controlled House, for being here to look ahead to the new Congress, specifically in the area of financial services. Thank you.
Thank you
very much.